you ever handed someone everything, your savings, your trust, your future, and then found out they were laughing at you the whole time? I'm 63 years old. I worked for 31 years as a contract compliance officer for a mid-sized construction firm in Columbus, Ohio. I am not a woman who makes impulsive decisions. I track numbers. I read fine print. I ask follow-up questions when other people have already left the room. My colleagues used to joke that I could find a loophole in a birthday card. So when my son came to me about his business idea, I didn't just hand him a check and wish him luck. I listened. I asked questions. I took notes on a yellow legal pad the way I always do. And eventually, after 4 months of conversations, I made a decision that I believed in completely. I want to be clear about that because what happened later, all of it, doesn't change the fact that I made that decision with my eyes open. I just didn't know at the time exactly what I was looking at. My son's name is Damon. He's 34, sharp as anyone I've ever met, and for most of his adult life he had this dream of building something of his own. He'd spent nearly a decade working for a logistics software company in Atlanta, climbing steadily, learning the industry from the inside. In late 2021, he came to me with a business plan for a last-mile delivery coordination platform, essentially software that helps smaller regional carriers compete with the big national players by optimizing their routing and load matching in real time. I'm not a tech person, but I understand contracts, liability, financial structure, and what it means when a business plan has holes in it. I read his proposal 3 times. I had a friend who does small business consulting look it over. I asked Damon about his revenue model, his burn rate projections, his contingency for a slow first year. He had answers, good ones. What I didn't fully account for was his wife. Her name is Jade. She and Damon had been married for about 2 years when this conversation started. She had a background in marketing, was smart and ambitious in her own right, and from the beginning she positioned herself as co-founder, which, fine, I understood that. It was going to be a family business in a sense. I wasn't threatened by that. What I missed were the signs I should have caught earlier. The way she steered conversations when I was visiting, the way Damon would start to explain something and then glance at her before finishing, the way she referred to the business as our vision, always our, never his, never theirs, in a way that included me. I told myself it was just personality, that she was assertive and I was reading too much into it. I had raised Damon to be his own man, and he had chosen her. I respected that. So in March of 2022, I transferred $400,000 into a business account that had been set up for the company, which they had named ClearHall Technologies. That money represented the majority of what I had saved outside of my pension and a small brokerage account I kept separate. It was not a gift. I was not operating under the assumption that I was writing a check and walking away. I was an investor. Now, here is where I need to slow down, because this part matters. Before I transferred a single dollar, I had a conversation with an attorney, a woman I'd worked with years before, who now specialized in small business and startup agreements. I explained the situation. She drew up an investor agreement. It was not complicated, but it was specific. It outlined my ownership stake in the company at 18%. It required quarterly financial reports to be delivered to me. It designated categories of expenditure that required my written authorization above a certain threshold. And it included a clause that tied a second tranche of funding, another $100,000 I had agreed to make available, to the company reaching a defined set of operational milestones within the first 18 months. Damon reviewed it. His wife reviewed it. They both signed it. I remember Jade's expression when she handed the paperwork back across the table. She smiled at me, and I thought it was warmth. I understand now that it was something else entirely. The first year went reasonably well, from what I could see. I got quarterly reports, basic, but they arrived on time. I heard about client meetings, early contracts with 2 small regional carriers in Tennessee and Kentucky. a hire or two. Damon called me every couple of weeks. We talked about the business, about life. Things felt normal. Then the calls got shorter. Then they came less frequently. Then there were stretches of 3 or 4 weeks where I was the one initiating. I told myself he was busy. Building a company is consuming. I remembered years of 60-hour weeks in my own career. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. In September of 2023, I called Damon to ask about scheduling a visit to Atlanta. I wanted to see the office, meet the small team they'd built, get a feel for how things were developing. He said he'd check with Jade about timing and get back to me. He did not get back to me. He did not get back to me. I followed up 2 weeks later. He said they had some things going on but would figure out a good weekend soon. I asked him directly how the business was going. He said good, really good actually. Things are picking up. He sounded genuinely positive. I flew to Atlanta in November. I had told Damon I was coming, gave him 2 weeks' notice, bought a non-refundable ticket, told him I'd stay at a hotel so I wouldn't be underfoot. We made a plan to have dinner Friday night, and then I'd stop by the office Saturday afternoon. Friday dinner was fine on the surface. We went to a nice restaurant in Midtown. Jade was there. The conversation covered a lot of topics: family, the holidays coming up, some renovation they were doing on their house. The business came up, but only briefly, mostly in abstract terms. When I asked specific questions about client growth or the milestone targets we had agreed on, Damon gave broad answers and Jade redirected to something else. I noticed. But I let it go for that night because I figured we'd have more time the next day. Saturday afternoon, I arrived at the office address I had in my records. It was in a commercial suite building in Buckhead. The suite was there. The signage was there. But something felt off the moment I walked in. The front area was clean. The branding looked polished, but there was an unfamiliar energy in the room. A young woman at the reception desk looked up and asked if I had an appointment. I told her I was Damon's mother. She blinked, then smiled carefully and said she'd let him know I was here. Damon came out looking surprised in a way that seemed slightly rehearsed. He hugged me, gave me a tour, introduced me to 2 people on his team, but the whole thing felt abbreviated, like I was a visitor, not a stakeholder. At one point, I asked about a particular piece of equipment I'd approved a budget allocation for months earlier, a server rack setup that had been listed in one of the quarterly reports. A team member within earshot glanced at Damon, just a half-second glance, but I caught it. I didn't say anything then. On the drive back to my hotel, I started running things through my head. The quarterly reports had been delivered on time, but they were thin, revenue summaries, basic expense columns, very little narrative. I had accepted them because the numbers weren't alarming. But sitting in that Uber, I realized I had been accepting surface information and not asking for the substance underneath it. That night, I made a list. Everything I wanted to verify, everything that felt slightly off. The list was longer than I expected it to be. I flew home Sunday morning. That same week, I contacted my attorney and asked her to review the reporting requirements in our agreement and tell me exactly what I was entitled to request. She confirmed that under the terms, I had the right to request full general ledger access and detailed expense documentation going back to day one, not just the summaries I'd been receiving. I sent a formal written request to Damon and Jade on a Thursday. Jade called me the following Monday. She did not call to discuss the request. She called to tell me that the request had made Damon upset and that she felt I was being intrusive. Her exact words, and I remember them precisely because I wrote them down after we hung up, were, "We appreciate everything you've done, but this is our company. We need room to run it." I said I understood her perspective and that I also had a signed agreement that entitled me to the information I had requested and that I would appreciate receiving it within the 30-day window specified in our contract. She said she would talk to Damon and get back to me. I want to pause here and tell you something. In that moment, I was not angry. I was deeply, quietly sad. Because I had known Damon since before he took his first breath. I had sat in the bleachers at every swim meet, driven him to SAT prep on Saturday mornings, co-signed his first apartment lease, and shown up for 34 years of his life without being asked to justify my presence. And now I was being told that asking for documentation I had a legal right to was somehow an intrusion. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not toward anger, toward clarity. 2 weeks passed. No documentation came. I sent a follow-up email. Another week passed. I received a partial response, a PDF with some expense summaries, clearly assembled in a hurry, missing multiple categories I had specifically requested. I forwarded it to my attorney. Then, on a Tuesday evening in early January, my phone rang. It was Jade. I answered. She told me there had been a company event, a milestone celebration. They'd rented a space, invited clients and a few local business contacts, done some press outreach. A reporter from a regional business journal had shown up. It had gone well. I asked when this had happened. She said the end of November, about 6 weeks earlier. I asked why I hadn't been invited or even informed. There was a pause. And then she said, and I want to be careful here to give you the actual meaning, if not every exact word. She said it had been put together quickly. It was really more of a client-facing event, and they had kept the guest list tight, close contacts. She used the phrase inner circle. I was quiet for a moment. Then I asked her directly, did she understand that I held an 18% ownership stake in this company? That the event had apparently been organized and paid for using company funds, and that I had not been notified of either the event or the expenditure. She said the spending was within the range that didn't require my authorization. I asked her to confirm that in writing. She said she'd have Damon follow up. He did not follow up. I want to tell you about that 6-week window between the event and Jade's call, because something happened in it that matters. 3 days before Jade called me, Damon had reached out. Not to tell me about the event, not to discuss the business. He called because he needed to talk about cash flow. The company had taken on a new carrier client, which should have been good news, but the contract terms delayed payment by 90 days, and in the meantime they had payroll and operating costs to cover. He was asking whether the second tranche of funding, the $100,000 tied to milestone performance, might be available sooner than originally structured. I listened to everything he said. I asked a few questions. I told him I would review the milestone criteria and the current financials and get back to him within the week. I did not tell him what I was thinking. I did not tell him what I had already set in motion. Here is what I need you to understand about that second tranche of funding. It had never been promised freely. The agreement was explicit. The $100,000 would be released only upon verification of 3 specific milestones: a minimum of 5 active carrier contracts, a defined revenue threshold for the trailing 12 months, and delivery of a complete audited financial statement, not summaries, not PDFs assembled overnight, a full audit by an independent CPA. When Damon called me about that funding, exactly none of those milestones had been verified. He had not delivered the audit. I had not confirmed the contracts or the revenue figure independently. The money, by every term of our agreement, was not available. I had my attorney send a formal response the following week. It was polite and professional. It acknowledged the cash flow challenge. It specified exactly which conditions remained unmet. It noted the outstanding documentation requests that had not been fulfilled, and it stated that the milestone-tied funding would not be released until the agreed conditions were satisfied in full. Damon called me that evening. He was not angry exactly, but there was an edge in his voice I hadn't heard in a long time. He said he felt like I was treating him like a stranger, like some outside investor who didn't know him. I told him quietly that an outside investor would have already been taking legal steps. I told him that I was his mother, and that was exactly why I was handling this the way I was. Because I wanted Clearhall to succeed, because I believed in what he was building, and because the structure we had agreed to existed to protect the business as much as it protected me. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said Jade said this would happen. I asked him what exactly she had predicted. He didn't answer directly. He said it was just that she'd always felt the investor agreement was more about control than about support. I asked him when he had started to share that feeling. He didn't have a clear answer. We stayed on the phone for almost an hour that night. It was the longest real conversation we'd had in months. I told him about the event I had never been told about. I told him what it had felt like to walk into that office and feel like a stranger. I told him about the incomplete documentation, the redirected conversations, the feeling that had been building for over a year, that something was being managed around me rather than with me. He was quiet in a different way by the end. Not defensive quiet, thinking quiet. I did not pile on. I did not ask him to take sides. I did not say a single critical word about Jade by name. I only described what I had experienced and what the documentation showed. I let him sit with it. 3 days later, he called back. He told me he had had a long conversation with Jade. He told me that some of what I had described he hadn't fully known, particularly around the event guest list. He said she had handled the event planning, and he had assumed the invite situation was fine. He said he understood that it wasn't. He asked me what I needed in order to move forward. I told him, specifically and without drama, I needed the full documentation I had requested. I needed a meeting with him, Jade, and a neutral third party. I suggested the business consultant I had used before the investment to review where the milestone targets stood. I needed acknowledgement, in whatever form felt right to him, that going forward I would be included in significant company events and decisions at the level appropriate to an 18% owner. He said he would make it happen. Here is what I will tell you about what happened after that, and I will be direct. It was not easy, and it was not fast, and it was not warm at first. The documentation meeting happened in February. My business consultant attended by video call. Jade was civil but cool. The financials, when we finally reviewed them together, showed that the company was in better shape than I had feared. Not perfect, but viable. The milestone gaps were real but closable within the next 2 quarters if they stayed focused. The $100,000 second tranche remained unreleased until April, when the independent audit came back clean and 2 additional carrier contracts were verified. At that point, I released it, as agreed, on the exact terms we had set 18 months earlier. Jade and I are not close. I don't expect we ever will be, but there is a working respect now that wasn't there before. And I think some of that came from the fact that I never went around Damon, never tried to go after her directly, and never used money as a weapon. I used it as exactly what it was, a conditional agreement. Nothing more. What I want to say to anyone out there who has helped a child financially, whether it was $5,000 or $500,000, whether it was for school or a car or a business, is this: money without structure is not generosity, it's exposure. It leaves you vulnerable and it leaves them unaccountable, and that combination doesn't protect the relationship. It erodes it. I loved my son enough to do this the hard way. I loved him enough to draw up a contract and enforce it. I loved him enough to make the calls he didn't want to receive and have the conversations he didn't want to have. And when he asked me, sometime last spring, whether I regretted the whole thing, the investment, the fight, all of it, I thought about it for a real moment before I answered. I said no. I regret none of it, because he's still building his company, and I'm still his mother. And we both know exactly where we stand. That's worth more to me than a check I could have written with no questions attached. People ask me sometimes if I feel like I won, and I always have to think about that for a second before I answer, because winning isn't really the right frame for any of this. What I know is that actions compound, not in some abstract philosophical way, in a very concrete cause and effect way that plays out whether you're paying attention or not. When Jade made the decision to exclude me from that launch event, when she made the follow-up decision to call me days later asking for money as if nothing had happened, she set something in motion. Not punishment, just consequence. The agreement I had put in place wasn't a trap I had set for her. It was a structure I had built to protect an investment and a relationship. She walked into it on her own. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I didn't have to do anything dramatic. I didn't have to threaten anyone or make ultimatums or blow up a family dinner. I just held the line on something I had already, clearly in writing, agreed to with both of them. The structure did the work. My job was just not to abandon it when things got uncomfortable. And it did get uncomfortable. Damon's voice on that phone call, that edge I hadn't heard in years, that stayed with me for a while. There is nothing easy about the moment your child implies you are being unreasonable for enforcing an agreement he signed. Nothing easy about it at all. But I had learned something over 31 years of contract work. The time to test whether an agreement means anything is exactly when honoring it is inconvenient. If it only holds when things are going smoothly, it was never really an agreement. It was just a formality. I think about the woman I was at 30, 40 years old, working long hours, building a career, trying to do right by my son as a single mother for most of his childhood. I didn't have anyone handing me structured capital. I figured things out the hard way, made mistakes that cost me, and learned from them slowly. What I was offering Damon wasn't just money. It was the accumulated judgment of a lifetime. The investor agreement wasn't a lack of trust. It was me giving him the same discipline I had applied to my own decisions for 3 decades. The same rigor I would have wanted someone to hold me to when I was young and confident, and certain I knew better. Wisdom isn't something you can hand to another person directly. You can only put conditions around them that make it more likely they'll arrive at it themselves. That's what those milestone clauses were. That's what the documentation requirements were. Not surveillance, structure that required accountability. The kind that builds something real over time versus the kind that collapses the moment the money runs out. Damon is still building Clearhall. Last I heard, they've brought on 2 more carrier clients and are starting to look at a Series A raise. He calls me more regularly now. The calls are different, more substantive, more honest. He asks my opinion on things. I give it when I have something worth saying and stay quiet when I don't. That's what I wanted all along, not control, not credit, just a seat at the table I helped build. If you've ever been in a position where you gave someone you loved more than you could afford to lose, and then watched them treat it carelessly, I want you to know this. You are not obligated to keep giving without structure just because you love them. Love and accountability are not opposites. The most loving thing I did for my son was refuse to make it easy for him to take me for granted. That decision cost us some hard months. It gave us back something that matters a great deal more.